Okay, welcome to everybody who's here. This is a presentation on upcoming grant opportunity looking for research projects that are assessing the effectiveness of interventions to improve women's land tenure security. My name is Elisa Scalise, and I am the Managing Director of Resource Equity. And Resource Equity is the lead organisation behind the Women's Land Rights Research Consortium, who are running this grant opportunity. Thank you to everyone who's joined the call. And just a note that we are also recording this, so it will be available online on the website. You're welcome to download the recording and listen to it at a later date. Also, if there are questions that come up through the course of the presentation, we'll be trying to answer them as we can, and if not, we'll provide we'll try to combine or collate the questions and answers and provide written responses on the website as well. So I'll start with a quick introduction. Oh, I've already done that. So again, my name's Elisa Scalise with Resource Equity. Resource Equity is an organisation. We work on advancing women's rights to land and resources around the world. We work in many different places and work on lots of different things, but ultimately we're looking to improve in practice the rights of women to land so that their lives can improve in reality. The Research Consortium is one of the initiatives that we have, and the purpose behind the Research Consortium is to address gaps that exist in the evidence today on what works to actually make a difference for women's land rights so that they can have so that women have better outcomes. And so the Research Consortium role is to kind of foster a community of practice among practitioners and researchers, but also to address gaps in the research that exists today so that more people can make more decisions that are based on evidence and proven approaches to what can actually make a difference for women's lives. So today I'm going to cover, I'll quickly go over the format of the webinar for you. I'll cover the objectives of the research grant. I'll talk about the substantive eligibility, and by that I mean what types of questions will we consider for grants. I'll also talk about the eligibility of applicants and the application process generally, then how to apply, and then we'll leave a little bit of time at the end for some Q&A. With the Q&A, I just wanted to let you know that you can type questions into the Q&A box that's on your Zoom screen. If that doesn't work for you, that's okay. You can also send questions in to rc@resourceequity.org. And I'll mention that again later once we get to that section of the presentation. So we'll start with the objective of the research grants. Overall, we're hoping that the research grants that are awarded will help contribute to the body of knowledge on the gender differentiated results of interventions that seek to reform land and resource tenure in a given place. We also want to understand the attributes of interventions, policies and reforms that make them better or worse for women and for outcomes for women. We want to understand the context in which these interventions take place and how the context influences their outcomes. We want to play a role in developing and disseminating best practices or good practices for research and programming that seek to reduce poverty or ensure better resource management or improve gender equity through land and resource tenure reforms. And we want to build or strengthen the capacity of people around the world to do research on gender and land rights in a way that actually helps to make a difference for women and to shift and shape policy and practice. So specifically with this round of research, there are certain substantive questions that we're interested in hearing or receiving grant applications on. I'm going to go through these now. You will hear that they're quite broad, But this is a really important thing, I think, to focus on as you think about your application and in how you craft your research question. The first is on, we're interested in questions on interventions that address all the dimensions of tenure security for women: completeness, durability, and robustness. And as a reference point there, I just want to point out that there are a number of different definitions for tenure security. The Research Consortium actually has developed one in association with some researchers that's available on our website. And I encourage you to take a look at that conceptual framework as it might be a helpful reference as you think about your application. And we can provide a link to that on our website as well. But the important thing to know here is that we're really interested in understanding all the dimensions of tenure security for women. So not just, for example, looking at land titling or just looking at women's role in governance, but also trying to understand how those features, how those programs affect the completeness of rights, the durability or duration of the rights, and the robustness of rights that women have to land. The other kind of research we're interested in is looking at the value to women of documenting land and property rights in tenure systems other than the private individual tenure. And by that we mean there is actually quite a bit of research at the moment on looking at the impacts of documenting private rights to land, so land titling and registration that's more of a traditional nature. But what we're interested is in the impacts for women, or the value to women, from the documentation of rights that maybe are based on collective tenure regimes, because there is a dearth of research in that topic. And we're also interested in interventions that improve women's participation in governance bodies of collectively held lands, but also how those interventions relate to better outcomes for women. Another type of research question we're interested in is on the intra-household effects of land rights reforms, particularly looking at the impacts on women in male-headed households. Part of the reason why this one is there is that a lot of the research that exists today is looking at women and the impacts of interventions tends to focus on women-headed or female-headed households. And there's less information on women in male-headed households. So looking at unpacking that household concept would be that area of questioning. Another type of research question we're interested in is on the sustainability of interventions or outcomes from a particular process, or on the potential for scaling specific interventions. And then we have the last two types of questions we're interested in are land tenure interventions that are appropriate to the experience of women in different stages of life or with diverse life experiences. And what we mean there is that there is today, to the extent that there is research today looking at women's land tenure security, it tends to refer to women as a homogenous group and doesn't look really at the different experiences of different women. So for example, women who are single, women who are widowed, women who are without children, women who've been displaced by war, or those types of things. So that would be research that looks at the different experiences of different kinds of women in the same context. And then finally, we're interested in research that addresses this question of social norms change and how an intervention can effectively foster social norm change, specifically related to women's land rights. So that was the substantive eligibility. I'm just going to touch now on applicant and application eligibility. So who can apply and what the application process would need to be. So grantees must be based in low and middle income countries. The grant funded research must be undertaken in low and middle income countries. Applicants must have a proven history and background on similar research. Applicants may be organisations or individuals, it doesn't matter for that. The reports must be able to be completed by the key deadlines provided below. There's one point I'll just say on that. The deadlines that were provided in the application material are indicative deadlines. Once the grants are awarded, we'll work with the grantees to come up with a timeline that's appropriate. We do have some kind of strict deadlines related to when this work overall needs to be completed. So we want to kind of maintain momentum once the grants have been awarded. But we do have some flexibility, and we'll work on with grantees on that specifically. More than one entry per applicant is acceptable, provided that the questions being asked are different. Applicants must clearly state the research question that aligns with the eligible topics that I just presented on. Applications and reports must be submitted in English. Right now we have some limitations on language, so English is the main language that we'll be using. Grant proposals can build on other research that already exists, or can use existing data available, or can collect new research. And the total grant amount requested cannot exceed $20,000 US. I just thought I'd quickly, while I'm here, I might just answer a question from one of our participants. And the question is, can the topic be about interventions that improve women's participation in governance bodies that refers to their participation within the internal organs of the community, or also within state institutions? That's a very good question. And actually, I think it could do, we would be fine with either of those things. Ultimately, what we're looking at is how can participation of women in whatever institutions appropriate for that context lead to, or can it lead to, better outcomes for women more generally. So that would be fine either way, either in community organs or also in state institutions. Thank you for that question. So I'll just move ahead. I lost my place here. Okay, now for how to apply. So it's because we're expecting a high volume of responses, it's really important that the applications really follow the guidelines that are provided. We've purposefully tried to make them very simple and provide guidance on about how much space and detail should be provided under each section. And I think it bears saying here that ultimately the clarity, so looking for really clear and succinct applications will make a big difference. And also it's okay if the research questions are quite narrow, provided that they are clear and have a good justification and analytical framework, and that the methodology is appropriate. So I'm saying that because I know sometimes the tendency can be to think very broadly and promise the world. But given the time and resources available for this, I think it's valuable to also think about what, more narrow questions that really get to the point of some of these substantive questions. So the first point is really focus on the guidance and the guidelines provided for the form, and do submit questions with sufficient response time if there's something about the application form that you don't understand or that you're having difficulty with. The application form should have a very clearly stated research question. So it must be succinct and clear, and it must refer to an intervention, whatever that intervention is, and then its effectiveness to make a difference for women with regard to property rights. The next section is the brief background section. In that background section, we would like to see a justification for that topic, for that question. So why is the question being offered, and make a clear connection between the intervention and the research question that's being proposed. And why is that question important for the context that you're working in, or for some other reason. The next section is an analytical framework. Here, it's important that you outline what kind of concepts and definitions you'll be working from to set the framework for your analysis and for your research. Again, you can refer to the conceptual framework that the Research Consortium developed for this, and that's has a very useful guide on key concepts for women's land tenure security, and also provides a good analysis of the universe of things you could consider when doing research on women's land rights. And so you could look at that and choose portions of it that you think are appropriate for your study and for your context. The analytical framework should also include a brief outline of the paper. You don't need a lot of detail here, but we really want to see what are the things you think you're going to be including in the report, so we get a sense of what the final product might look like. Now that can change, of course, as you start writing it, but the idea here is to have you put some thought into how you might present an answer to the research question that you've provided, given the methodology that you're using. The next section is on the research methodology. In here you want to describe the methodology and then also explain how the method's appropriate for the question being proposed. Then you'll include the lead author's bio. There can be other bios included here if there's enough space, but really we're interested in the person who's going to put their name to the piece and what their background and experience is in doing similar research. The next section is actually something, a new thing that we're trying at the Research Consortium. It may not be appropriate for everybody, but if you do think that there are capacity needs that you have, where some perhaps training or information or resources might be helpful for you, it's completely fine for you to identify that as part of this application. If there are no capacity needs, that's fine as well. But really here what we're trying to get at is, if, for example, you are an organization that's very experienced in doing quantitative research, but you'd like to add an element of qualitative research, and there's a particular approach you're interested in, you can let us know. And we'll try to connect you with people who are expert on those methods. So really the idea with the capacity needs is for you to think about whether you have the skills and capacity in-house to be able to deliver the research project, and if there are specific things that you think might be helpful for you as you engage in the process. And we will try, as part of the process, once the grants have been awarded, to assist with that capacity development. The next section is references. We'd like you to provide some references just to show that you've done similar work and that people can vouch for your abilities to do that. And then finally is the budget and budget narrative. The budget need not be too detailed. A short spreadsheet is okay. But really the budget narrative will just go along with the budget to describe, what's included and what's not in the budget, so we can get a sense of your cost breakdown and things like that. We encourage you to to think expansively or holistically and try to include the true costs of doing this work, because we know that there are costs associated with it. But for also in your budget narrative, it's important that you show that the costs that you have in there are reasonable given the research that's being done and the methodologies that are being used. And finally, the overall application is due on Friday, January 31st at 5 p.m. Eastern Time in Australia. That's partially because that's where I am currently based right now, but I do want to make a note for those of you who are on different time zones that could mean the beginning of your day, especially if you're further west. I'm just going to take a quick look now while we're here to see what questions have come up that relate to the how to apply section of the presentation. And if I can answer some of them, I'll do that now. So just give me 1 minute. Okay. So the first question is asking whether it can be a research question that examines, analyses and consolidates a variety of socio-legal responses developed and practiced by various organisations for ensuring land rights for women. I think that would be a fine question. However, I think it's really important, again, that you look at that you're able to make some kind of link between the intervention and the effectiveness of on outcomes for women. So really focusing on this idea that there's a specific intervention that you're looking at. So if those socio-legal responses can be categorized as an intervention, and you can put parameters around how that's described, then I think that that would be, and then can be linked to outcomes for women, then I think that that would be a fine question to submit. The next question is, can a non-profit engage a consultant in the research process? Absolutely. If that's the approach that you want to take, that's fine. And then you would have to decide who would you include in the bio as the lead author. I think that would be the important thing to consider then, because we will be looking at the lead author's background to determine the grant decision. The next question is, should we also include a schedule of activities? That's a good question. I think you can, if I would include that in the methodology section, as long as you have space. It's not critical at this stage to provide the schedule activities, but if there's space in the application, I think it's fine to do that, because it will help show that you've put thought into how you'll deliver the grant report on time and using that methodology that you've chosen. Okay, one more question here. You say applications and reports must be submitted in English. Is it possible to provide a budget line for translation? Yes, that's completely fine. If you need to budget for translation, that's fine, so that you can meet the English language requirements. Thank you for asking that. That's a good question. And let me see what else I have here. Just one moment while I take a minute to review the questions. Okay, I'm back on. I just had a quick review of the questions that we hear, and I'm going to answer the ones that are possible to answer right now. The first question is, can there be more than one lead author, and are there any types of budget items that won't be accepted? There can be more than one lead author. I think there are no budget line items that cannot be accepted, but I think using the reasonable measure is probably the best way to consider what to include in the budget. A second question is, can we conduct a national level workshop for dissemination? If budget permits that, that's completely fine. And we can also work with you on dissemination once processes and planning once the grant has been awarded. Another question. So there's a question in here that's asking about specific research questions. I won't answer that one here because I'm not sure that it will be helpful for the whole group. I think the main thing to know about when thinking about research questions is going back to what I said about just being, as long as the research question that's posed is very succinct and clear and is looking at an intervention, a specific intervention, and how effective that was to improve women's land rights, and that it also links to those topical areas that we mentioned at the beginning. So as long as you can kind of make those links, all the range of research questions is quite broad. Someone asked the question of whether there's whether we're limited to urban or rural contexts. When we're talking about land rights, there's no limitation. It can be rural or urban, whichever makes the most sense for the context you're working in. Okay, can we share a link to the Research Consortium's framework? Absolutely. We will do that on the website. It's currently on the website, and we may be able to link it to a chat. Oh, if you don't find it on the website, you can also email rc@resourceequity.org, which is the same email that was also provided in the initial invitation to apply. But we will also post a link to the framework on the application website. Another question says, should the applicant be a research body? If there was an individual doing the research with a different topic, is it also eligible? Oh, I think it can either be an organization doing the research or it can be an individual. That's okay. And we also do accept multiple applications from the same organizations or the same persons. You probably wouldn't be awarded more than one grant, but we can accept multiple research questions if you have them from the same individual or same organization. And then the final question posed is there a limit in pages for the applications? And to that question, I will refer you to the application annex. It's part of the application information packet. And for each section, you'll see there's a guide maximum length for each section. So for example, for the research question, for the methodology section, and for the various other sections, there is a limit or a suggested maximum. So you should use that as your guide for how long the application should be. And then I think there's one final question. We mentioned there was some flexibility in dates. Okay, how much flexibility is there? Thanks for that question. We have a fairly, how can I be the most clear about this? So the guideline, the deadlines that were provided are indicative, meaning that would be a schedule, you know, when looking at a calendar that would make a lot of sense. We have a little bit of flexibility, I would say between 2 and 4 weeks to change that schedule, but we don't have, say, the flexibility to add another, 4 or 5 months to it. So when I say flexibility, I guess it is within the range of 2 to 4 weeks in addition to what's already been proposed. And last two questions. Let me see. Oh, last question. Oh, good question. Do you have a preference for qualitative or quantitative methodologies? Does that impact on getting the grant? That's a good question. And actually, we don't have a preference for qualitative or quantitative. There are, of course, benefits and drawbacks for each. The key thing that we're looking for is that the methods that are used are appropriate for the questions that are being asked and that have been posed. So provided that that strong link is made in the methodology section that links closely to the research question, then it doesn't matter if it's qualitative or quantitative, but more so how well that link can be made and whether the approach that's chosen is appropriate for the question that's being asked. Okay, and I think we had one last question. Okay, it says, how long is the grant valid for? Do we need to complete the research within a certain time? For that, I'll direct you to the application packet. It does provide an indicative timeline for not just the submission of the first draft, but also any revisions that might be needed. Just so you know, the process will be, we will have the papers reviewed by staff at Resource Equity and possibly also peer reviewed, so that we will allow for some time to conduct those review processes, and also the grantees will be asked to kind of work on revisions that are reasonable that come out of that review process. If you just give me one more minute. I think that there's another avenue for asking questions, which is the chat section of the page. So I am just going to quickly check that section to see if there are any questions that I can answer now. I will go on mute for 1 minute.
It's just one there saying hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Can organize just one.
So there's a question here that says, can an organisation address more than one specific area? By that, I think the question's asking whether it can look at more than one context, so a part of the country. If that's the case, yes, that's fine, provided that it can be done within the parameters of the research question and the methodologies being used. If the question's asking whether it can address more than one question or more than one subject area, that's fine as well. Although I would suggest that to the extent that you have different research questions that you're looking at, you submit separate applications for each question that's being posed. Because we're really interested, as I said earlier, in the research question itself being a very clear and succinct question that can be answered within using the methodology that's been proposed. Okay, and one final question, which is, how will the grant payment be made? Oh, grant payments will be made through wire transfer or whatever is appropriate for the grantee. Okay, I think that to the extent, there are a couple of other questions here, but I think that they can be answered through looking at the question can be answered by looking through the application materials in terms of how to send in the application and the timeline for submissions and reports. There's a quick question there about whether more than one organisation can apply together as a consortium. That's fine. Can an international organisation be included? That's fine as well, but we really want to make sure that people from low to middle income countries have the opportunity to apply and to lead this work. So it's really important that leadership and the lead author comes from the low and middle income countries. And then someone asked about the requirements for the research paper length. There's no requirements for the length. It's really about what's appropriate given the research question and the results and the methodology chosen. So I think we've answered all of the questions. As I mentioned earlier, that was not meant to happen. If you have further question, I'll just put up the email address there again. There's, if you have questions, you can send them to rc@resourceequity.org. Just because of time zones and things, there could be about a 48-hour turnaround on answering those questions, but we'll do our best to respond to questions. We'll also compile, if there are questions that are coming up frequently, we will compile an FAQ and we will post that on the website in the coming days, because it looks like there's a lot of questions that are common to many people. Other than that, I thank you all for joining the webinar for today. And again, I encourage you to pay attention to the website and keep following there. Send any questions in that you have to rc@resourceequity.org. And if need be, the recording of this webinar will be available on the website as well, in case you may have missed some of my answers. I thank you all very much for your interest in this opportunity, and we're very excited at the Research Consortium to have a great response so far, and we look forward to some very good and interesting research proposals presented to us on January 31st. Thank you all very much for your time.